Welcome everyone to this special episode of the Power of the Wind, Offshore Energy Insights. I'm your moderator, Ufuk Yaman, Vice President responsible from offshore wind energy at the Turkish Wind Energy Association. Today, we have a very special guest. We have hosted her before, Rebecca Williams, the Global Head of Offshore Wind at GWEC. But recently, they have issued their 2024 report for global offshore wind energy. And we wanted to discuss the details of the report and key findings with her. And she was very kind to accept our request and to join us today at our webinar. Today, we will explore the key findings, as I said, industry trends and future prospects of offshore wind energy. And please feel free to ask questions if you have any. We will receive it through the chat box, and at the end of the speech, I will gather the questions and direct to Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Ufuk. So good to be here again. Really pleased to be with you here today to discuss the Global Offshore Wind Report this year.
Thank you. Then I'm directly diving into the exciting report. So we are always looking for the updates every year, and I've been reading your reports for a while now, and I want to ask, what is the progress in the installed power right now? How does it look? How does it match with our expectations from the previous years?
So firstly, great to hear that you're a Global Offshore Wind Report super fan. Glad that you've been following along for these years. And yeah, let me tell you about the report this year. So our findings this year are that the global growth story of offshore wind continues apace. It's a really exciting picture out there right now. And what we're seeing in the data is that actually offshore wind had its second strongest year in terms of growth that we've ever seen. So actually last year, we saw 24% year-on-year growth versus the year before. Installations got to 10.9 gigawatts, so 11 gigawatts installed last year. And then we also saw that total cumulative installation, so the amount of offshore wind installed in total, reached 75 gigawatts globally. So actually, when we're looking at installed capacity, it's a positive picture that we see. But actually, the kind of true story of the report is somewhat behind those numbers, because the numbers, they look backwards at what's been achieved so far, and we also have an outlook which looks forwards. But actually, some of the developments that we've seen in the market are not yet reflected in those numbers because, as we know, offshore wind projects take some time to come online. And actually, what we see outside those numbers is that we globally, we're experiencing a new wave, a new frontier when it comes to offshore wind. And a new set of markets is emerging and going really from that kind of emerging market status, graduating towards more mature markets. And some of those countries are, for example, Japan, South Korea, Australia. So we're seeing this kind of middle pack of markets now really coming through strongly and graduating from their emerging market status.
It's great to hear that, but I hope Turkey will also join to that club and have their first concrete pipeline and we are working towards that as Turkish Wind Energy Association. So yeah, you have provided some information about the geographical distribution, yes, but I have actually two questions here. How does your pipeline progressing throughout the years? How did it progress, like with your expectations? And also, we are talking about the geographical distribution, but do we have enough details from China? We see the numbers, yes, but I always have these questions behind my head. Are these values correct? Can we trust them? How do you validate this data you have from like these markets, growing markets, emerging markets, let's say? China is not an emerging market, but like maybe
far
market
from it,
that is not
yes.
on the West, let's say.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a few different questions there. Let's unpack those questions. So first of all, when we look forward, there's a question here about what we're expecting to happen in the market going forwards. If we look at a 1.5 degree trajectory globally and how much offshore wind will need to meet that trajectory, we're looking at least 380 gigawatts, of capacity by 2030 and 2,000 gigawatts by 2050. So the good news is, according to GWEC's assumptions in our outlook, which is a very robust outlook built up of our own in-house market intelligence capabilities, we see that actually on our 10-year rolling time horizon, that by 2033, we're actually in a position where we have exceeded that 380 gigawatt target. So that's really good news, but we're only going to get there if we can actually put in place the regulatory frameworks in order to deliver that. So that's an outlook based on what we see around us, but obviously it makes quite a lot of assumptions about the trajectory of offshore wind. I think this is a really important point because what we've seen globally is a desire to put in place targets, which is fantastic. You know, the role of targets is to set that trajectory, that horizon. It can be very useful in attracting investment, but actually what we need to see now is delivery against those targets. So it's the headline message is it's fantastic that we see this in the outlook, but really the hard work of realizing that outlook is now needs to be done. And in the report, in the kind of policy section of the report, we offer a 7-point plan for being able to push forward the regulatory framework across a number of different vectors. So across financing, across also the demand for offshore wind and how we ensure that the demand is cross-sectoral, looking at key issues like grids, supply chain, community consensus and social acceptance, and the role of permitting in fast-tracking offshore wind and in reducing risk. So that's the first part of the question. Your second question was around the numbers. You know, how can we trust the numbers? Where do the numbers come from? And also the role of China in the global picture for offshore wind. So let's break that down as well. So the numbers that go into making this report, as I mentioned, are our own in-house numbers, and we peer review those and cross-reference and benchmark them against notable other outlooks such as BNEF, such as Wood Mackenzie, etc. So they're robust numbers. One of the true joys and strengths of GWEC is that we also have association members like yourselves from around the world, which we cooperate with, collaborate with, and which help us in our kind of decision making as well. And so just as we have the Turkish Wind Energy Association, we also have other associations from around the world that also help us sense check these numbers and provide this data to us. So we also have the data from China, thanks to our partnerships also with some of the Chinese associations in our wider membership. I think that's important so we can get a really accurate picture of what's happening out there in the market. So these numbers are very trustworthy. We can be certain that they're highly robust and based on all that benchmarking that I was talking about there. And then there's another question around the role of China in the global offshore wind marketplace. And absolutely, just as we have said for many years that Europe has, led the way when it comes to offshore wind, so too has China really taken the opportunity of offshore wind and run with it to push forward a very strong domestic offshore wind industry. And the numbers absolutely reflect that. So if we look at the global numbers, we see that there has been a strong role for China in pushing forward offshore wind and deploying offshore wind, just as we've also seen that there's been a strong role for Europe. So really, it's been a kind of tale of two key places there in pushing forward offshore wind globally. But again, to come to my earlier point, now what we're seeing is it's not just a story of Europe and China and a little bit of the US. Actually, what we see in the report and what we're seeing out there in all the advocacy that we're doing is that there's now a much wider group of countries which are pursuing offshore wind and really taking their markets to the next stage. So I mentioned a few before, but again, South Korea, Japan, Australia, the Philippines. Really hope that Turkey will be part of that growing number as well. We're seeing lots of developments in India at the moment and also in Brazil, so as well as Colombia. So there's an ever-growing pack of markets which are now looking towards running their first tenders or have just recently run their first tenders or even moving now towards second and third tenders. So I think that's a really exciting picture because what we're seeing is diversification of the global marketplace. And that's something that I find really exciting as more and more countries are taking forward the opportunity for offshore wind in terms of growing their own economy. And one of the other trends that we're seeing coming through in the report is that it's no longer just about the power sector. It's no longer just about providing, clean, cheap power. Actually, the use case for offshore wind is now also about economic growth, whether that's in coastal communities or whether that's, working collaboratively with other sectors to decarbonize those sectors in the production of things like green steel, green shipping fuels, ammonia, etc. So there's a really exciting revolution happening, another industrial revolution in many of these countries as they look to offshore wind to play a strong role in their economic growth going forwards. And maybe just to pause a little bit on the numbers. I mean, when we look at the numbers in the report and in our outlook, we still see that a lot of the growth in the global industry will come from the APAC region as the next region, which will really drive installations of offshore wind. And there'll be a few countries which I've already mentioned, which will have a head start in this regard. But last year we saw that 41 gigawatts of offshore wind in operation in APAC, and we only expect that number to keep growing.
Yes. So, I'm happy that we have a more distributed pipeline and also geographical distribution is diversifying. We are also advocating a similar topic in Turkey because our onshore wind resources seems to be more feasible than offshore in many locations. And by feasible, I mean LCOE. But if we didn't kickstart the onshore wind in Turkey in 12 years ago, and we financed it a lot, we've provided feed-in tariffs, we would not have this huge industry exporting globally right now, mostly to Europe. And we are also envisioning the same future for offshore wind energy in Turkey, that we have to push it as soon as possible. We have to have our first installed powers as soon as possible. So we have the foundations of the industry, the supply chain. Let's then step to my next topic. So regarding the technology and innovation side, we've been watching this huge progress in the rotor diameters and rated powers. The turbines are getting bigger and bigger. Right now, we have 16 megawatt wind turbines that are on sale. And now we're discussing 20 megawatts are coming up. And even on the design, we see 25 megawatts being planned right now. And Western OEMs are complaining that this progress are the biggest problem in front of the reduction on the capex. LCOE consequentially. What do you think about that? And second, I want to also discuss with you the progress on the floating wind side, because that is very key for most of the Mediterranean basin, that the future for offshore lies on the floating wind technology. Could you please provide information on these two topics?
Yes, I'm laughing because that was two questions. That was more than two questions disguised as two questions, I think. So again, let's just sort of dive into that in a bit more detail. From the GWEC perspective, we're undertaking a lot of work on the topic of global supply chain at the moment. And actually, for those who aren't aware, at the end of last year, so at COP27 in Dubai, we launched a report which looks at the supply chain, the global supply chain for wind across onshore and offshore, and whether the supply chain in its current state is suitable to get to 1.5 degrees, a 1.5 degree trajectory. And we worked on that report with the Boston Consulting Group. And as part of this report, we modeled different scenarios for the supply chain. What we found was the only supply chain that gets us to a 1.5 degree scenario is one where we have international and globalized trade, but also one where, you know, we're able to build up strong supply chains which can benefit from that trade in terms of their component parts. The other key finding from that work, which you referred to, I believe, at the beginning of this interview, was the topic of supply chain availability. And it's true that we still see that there will be gaps in the global supply chain from 2026 when it comes to offshore wind in terms of availability of key component parts. Now, I think that's a big challenge in our ability to meet 1.5 degrees and for certain countries to be able to meet their own climate goals. And I think we're starting to see some of these shortages also hit the market, in all honesty, as we look at key kind of supply chain components and services. We're starting to see that, you know, there's just not enough out there to satisfy the demand, particularly in emerging markets, particularly when it comes to the Asian area as well. So that remains the dynamic. Now you could look at this and think, oh God, this is also terrible. Well, you know, this is a huge challenge for the industry. Or you can look at it from a positive framing and think, well, actually, this means that we need innovation in how we deal with this challenge. Actually, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for different countries to play a different role to what they have played so far within the global supply chain, especially when we're looking at things like critical raw minerals and which countries may have access to those kinds of product. And we can also see that there's an opportunity for innovation within the supply chain to standardize, to grow, and to look not just at innovation in terms of height of turbine, but to look at innovation in the wider sector. I think in general, it's really important that the industry keep sight of the global growth objective. There's so much demand now for offshore wind out there. And as I mentioned, one of the key challenges is that many of the markets that we will be working in may not be able to access the components that they need. This is something that we need to solve. And actually, with this growth mindset, I think it presents a really exciting opportunity for the supply chain as a whole. So if anyone who's listening is more interested to dive into those numbers in more detail, I would urge you to have a look at that report that we published last year. The other thing that we're doing is, as a result of that report, we are producing different regional versions of that report to unpick that data in even more granular detail. So the first one of that series will be looking at the Asian and APAC supply chain and understanding which countries in APAC can play which role. That will be the first in a series of these reports to really map out the global supply chain in greater detail. So on the supply chain question, I think, you know, we are going to start to see some of these constraints, and really, as a global industry, I think it's imperative that we keep in mind this growth momentum that we need to see and work together to grow that global supply chain to meet that demand. Otherwise, we're going to have a situation where we're not able to deliver against the promises that we have made to governments around the capability of offshore wind. So then coming to the point around innovation and turbine size, etc. I mean, I already spoke a little bit about that, but I think so far we've had quite a narrow definition of innovation where, you know, it's just a case of kind of ever bigger is better. I think what we need to see now is innovation across the supply chain in different ways. And actually, some of the innovation that led to cost reductions in the North Sea scenario were not just around turbine size, but were also around innovations in financing, innovations in different parts of the life cycle and supply chain, growing the supply chain in order to meet demand, and working between developers and supply chain to have a stronger partnership. So I think there's different innovations that we can see in different places. The role of artificial intelligence and different programs in being able to drive efficiencies as well is something that I think, you know, and I'm sure a lot of manufacturers and supply chain companies will be looking in close detail at the moment. So I think, you know, this industry was always born of innovation, and I think we need to continue that innovative mindset, but kind of make sure that it's not just a narrow focus going forwards. The other part of your question was around LCOE. And as I discussed there, I think, you know, we've seen a lot of cost reduction in the European example. I think it's worth bearing in mind that different frameworks get us to slightly different results when it comes to cost reduction. So, for instance, if you compare the market in the Netherlands or in Germany, where there's a very kind of centralized, or Denmark, where there's a very centralized process, versus a process where the developer takes on more risk. You know, there is a cost to risk. The more you reduce risk, the more you can reduce LCOE. Of course, I'm sure your listeners will understand that pivotal point. I think for a lot of the emerging markets that we're working in, the key question is who's best placed to take on this risk, and how can mechanisms help to de-risk. So one of the main focuses of the report is also on financing. How can we create the right instruments to bring in money from different places to then reduce the risk in the construction and development of offshore wind? So I would urge everyone to have a look at that section. It's relatively comprehensive because it goes into detail about how different types of blended finance could work together to reduce risks in emerging markets for offshore wind. In general, the trend with LCOE is that due to you know, factors that we've seen as a result of the war in Ukraine, result of commodity price increases, we have seen, and I'm sure you'll know this from looking at other outlooks, we have seen a slight increase versus where we were a few years ago when it comes to LCOE. But I think some crystal ball gazing, we need to see what happens to those rates of inflation, what happens to those commodity prices and the stabilization of those things in order to answer the next question. But I think we do see that particularly in emerging markets, there's a lot of scope for this learning by doing in order to reduce LCOE. One of the key points actually you made earlier was that for Turkey, it's about getting that pipeline in order to be able to push through those learnings, both on the supply chain, but also in terms of LCOE, right? The more that the pipeline exists, the more confidence investors have, the more investments can be made into the supply chain and the more LCOE reduction can be achieved. But again, if anyone's interested, they can dive into that in a bit more detail in the report itself.
My final question. How do you think that path for sustainable growth should be for offshore, especially for the diversified geographical distribution, as you mentioned earlier?
Well, I'm sorry. Also, I didn't answer your question about floating wind, which was a mistake of mine. Very quickly, then, on floating wind. I mean, we have a full outlook in the report, and we have slightly reduce the forecast of floating wind because of some of these headwinds we've seen globally when it comes to inflation, etc., and some of the dynamics in the market. But we do still think that floating wind will have a very strong role to play. And actually what we're seeing now is, is still this kind of race for floating wind. We've seen some really positive developments in the Japanese market of late around an effort to standardize floating wind turbines, turbines and the wider floating structure. And also, I think with the new government in the UK, which has come into power in recent weeks, it will be really interesting to see now how the UK progresses its floating industry. I think there are other countries who are really pushing the floating agenda. So it would be great to see those countries also collaborate through some of the initiatives that we here at GWEC have set up, such as the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. So looking forward to speaking to those countries more about that. But just to come to your question, which was about how do you kind of see the market going forwards for offshore wind? Absolutely. I think just to sum up, we're still very optimistic about the trajectory for offshore wind. The demand is out there, the use case is out there. I think the challenges have been suffered by lots of different sectors over the last couple of years, so around inflation, commodity prices, but the offshore wind sector remains resilient. We have seen some challenges, particularly in the US market, but I'm confident that those are now reaching resolution. Saw some challenges also in the UK as a result of decisions that were taken around policy. But again, I think it looks like that those issues will be resolved over the coming weeks and months. So actually, I think it remains a very exciting picture for offshore wind globally. There are some challenges, but of course, what we need to all do now is focus on this collaboration to unlock those challenges and keep on growing the market.
I'm now checking the questions. I've received few. I want to try to not to repeat the information that you have already provided. So in Turkey, we have a new development for offshore wind energy. Now the institutions will not require building permit. It is only for offshore wind to speed up the process of project development. What do you think about this? One of the viewers asked that, if you have seen this anywhere in the world, or is it really good idea to follow this path?
So offshore wind does not need planning permission in Turkey, is that correct?
Just for the construction phase. We have to do the environmental and social impact assessments. We have to do technical studies, but we don't have to obtain a construction building permit. That's the last part of it. But it is a very painful process in Turkey where you have to get through all the municipalities on your way and then obtain the permit for construction, like a building, any building.
I think anything that we can see as an industry to streamline permitting and planning procedures is a good thing, as long as there is a robust environmental and social impact assessment performed and undertaken, and we ensure that offshore wind is built in harmony with nature and with communities. But I think speeding up by streamlining permitting can be a very effective tool and can be something which investors find very compelling. In a lot of the countries that we're working in, it's very difficult to obtain permits, and maybe, for instance, in one market, I know that you have to go to 13 different ministries and agencies to obtain one single permit, which just is absolutely ridiculous. So I think there's a lot of scope for such innovations, and great to hear that that's something that's being rolled out in Turkey.
One of the questions, this one is also nice. One of our viewers is asking about the cheap financing for offshore wind. Is this really happening, or is it? So I know GWEC is also pushing for this. World Bank also,
Yes.
SMAP issued a report on that. But is it happening, or is it still something that we just advocate?
That's a good question. I think I've already outlined some of that in my answers. So when I talked about financing and the role of concessional and blended financing, what that actually means is products which bring together capital from multilateral development banks with private bank capital and hopefully with some kind of good regulatory policies to de-risk. Exactly how this can work in the structure of offshore wind, where you have project financing, is something that I think is still being worked through. We have seen examples of developers using or trying to access blended finance in this way. And I'm aware that a lot of the multilateral development banks are also thinking of this kind of financing to unlock grid infrastructure or make investments in things like grids or ports, which I think is a very worthwhile way to focus that capital. But I'd say that there's still things that we need to work out as an industry about how this does interact with with project financing structures. And this is something that GWEC will be looking at within the context of the Global Offshore Wind Alliance when we go to the UN General Assembly in September. So really advancing this discussion with all the governments around the table on this topic. And it would be fantastic for Turkey to join in that discussion in the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. So looking forward to working with the Turkish Wind Energy Association to make that happen, perhaps.
Yeah, we are happy to contribute. There are more questions, but I believe the audience can find these answers in the report as well.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
Do you have any last words before we close, Rebecca?
Just my last words are that, as I said, it's an optimistic picture that we see out there. There are challenges, but I think the industry as a whole needs to maintain this global growth mindset and continue the strong collaboration with policymakers and with wider stakeholders. The initiatives that GWEC have set up are all about this collaboration. So GOA, which is collaborating with governments, and the Ocean Energy Pathway, which is about collaborating also with civil society actors and making the wider socio-economic case for offshore wind development. So I would encourage greater collaboration, but let's think in new ways about how we can do that. Let's learn by doing. That's another theme of the report. So get the pipeline. Let's deliver against the targets. But I think, despite these challenges, the sector is remarkably resilient, and we need to remember also that the demand is out there. Let's remember also why we're undertaking this, because offshore wind is a compelling technology. It offers lots of system benefits in addition to the benefits we see from onshore wind, for instance, and solar. It's a great technology to give that kind of base load style, continuous, large scale power. So I think for those reasons, the outlook is very positive. It's just now about realizing that outlook and making sure there's enough bankable projects out there to meet that demand.
Thank you, Rebecca, again for accepting our invitation and being with us today to discuss the latest report. We have reached to the end of our webinar today, and I hope to see you again, hopefully in Hamburg, or even before that in September with you and the Global Wind Energy Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for watching us. We have explored a range of critical topics about the most recent report of GWEC. We will continue our webinars, Power of the Wind, Offshore Wind Energy Insight, in the future. Have a wonderful day and stay engaged in the transformation of our global energy systems. Have a good day.